All right, and now that we have our stock for our leg assemblies from either doing stock breakout or getting the excess cutoffs from our end pieces and our side pieces, we can now move on to ripping on the table saw to widths of 20 millimeters. So this ripping process is the same as before. The only difference is now that we're ripping to 20 millimeters, it's quite a bit more narrow. So if we were to try to do that regularly as we'd learned before, we would bring our fence to 20 millimeters from the blade, and then we would be able to use our push stick to push things through. But due to the splitter, it would make things really difficult to push our piece all the way through, and it wouldn't be a very safe operation. So because of this, I have this auxiliary fence here that I've made that we're going to clamp to our fence, and now we're going to be using this lower profile to run our wood across. So this is now our new fence edge that we're going to measure from our blade to. So just to show you quickly, if I bring that to about 20 millimeters away from our blade, and I'm to run the push stick all the way through, it's much easier because now I have all this room that was previously taken up by the fence, but now it's much easier to run my push stick all the way through. So I'll show you the setup again, just so that we have clarity on how to install the fence, how to set everything up for cutting, and then how to rip smaller widths. It's going to be the same process if we're doing our board that's 480 millimeters or our cutoffs. With the cutoffs, you'll just have to do a few more setups with the feather board, and with the wider board, that's 480 millimeters in length, you might not be able to use a feather board for the first cut as it passes the T-track, but once we are able to use it, we want to make sure we're using it whenever possible. So setup for this auxiliary fence is very simple. It's just an L shape, similar to the fences we've used at the drill press. But in this case, we're going to be installing it like this, so that this edge is our leading edge on our fence. And we're going to just use two C-clamps, one on the front side, one on the back side, to secure it to our fence. So tighten that one. And tighten one on the back. And it's going to be important that our C-clamps are installed this way rather than with this going towards our wood. We want the screw part going away. So we want the smaller profile towards our fence side. So now that is firmly snug, it's flush against the table, and now this is our new fence edge. So adjusting it goes the exact same as before. We're going to be doing our measurement off of this edge now instead of this edge. So now for setting the width from the fence to our blade, it's the same as before. We're going to get our tape measure and we're going to measure it to 20 millimeters. The only difference is now instead of measuring from the fence over here, we're measuring from the low side of our new auxiliary fence. So the same goes before, just bring it in until we get to 20 millimeters on the right side of the table saw blade. And once we're at 20, we're going to lock that down. There we are, 20 millimeters. And now I know the gap between here is 20 millimeters. And if you can see, it will fit our push stick clearly, so we don't have to worry about cutting off our push stick. So we should be good to use the setup. And again, we want to make sure we set our blade height just like before. So to do so, we can put our stock beside our blade and raise or lower it so that it's about the bottom of the gullet. And with this particular cut, if we want to err with a little bit less blade showing, it's probably going to be a bit safer, as this is a bit more of a complicated cut. Okay, again, we have our auxiliary fence installed with two C-clamps. The distance from the inside of the auxiliary fence to the inside of the blade is 20 millimeters. So that's what's going to be left on my piece. I've got my reference edge against that auxiliary fence. My blade height is set. My splitter is installed. I'm ready to go. Once I'm able to use a feather board, so once my board comes past this T-track, I'll use a feather board, but for now I can only use my hand. So I'll be using my hand in place of the feather board, so that'll be keeping pressure down as well as towards the fence. I'll be wearing eye protection, and I'll show you how this first cut goes. Now I have a rough piece with one reference edge that I know is 16 millimeters thick, and this side I'll end up tuning down on the small thickness planer once I have the rest cut. But in between cuts, because this is a rough edge, I want to visit the jointer and put one quick joint on that until that's nice and flat, then rewrite RE for reference edge, and then I'm going to do that process again. So I still can't quite fit the feather board, so I'll be doing one more cut without, and then I'll have the feather board installed. I have visited the jointer and I have a new reference edge, and I'm going to do the same cut as before. So same as before, I'm going to visit the jointer, and then I'll be right back to install the feather board and do my last two cuts. So now I have two pieces with reference edges and with rough sides. And now I am also able to install my feather board. So I'm going to move this to the line that says feather board on it. I'm going to tighten the knobs that say first, and then with the knobs that say second will be loose. I'll put my board in here. I'll put a little bit of pressure with the feathers, snug that up so that it goes one way easier and it's harder to pull back. If my board was thicker on one side than the other, I would want to make sure I install the feather board using that side, as it will get harder and harder to push if I do it with the thinner side or the smaller width side. So you want to make sure you install it with the wide side rather than the narrow side. So now that we have that, our reference edge is still against the fence. Now I'm going to do one more cut with the feather board here. Again, afterwards I'll go to the jointer to put one more joint edge on, or one more reference edge on, and then I'll do this process again. One more visit to the jointer, and then I'll have all four pieces. So we have readjusted the feather board, and if you were using offcuts, your pieces would probably be about as skinny as this, maybe a little bit slimmer. So for you, all of your cuts are going to look similar to this, whereas with the stock breakout, your board might be a bit wider. So if you're doing option one and using the pieces that were offcuts, all of your pieces are going to look similar to this cut. But again, we have a reference edge. We've got our feather board installed, everything set up the same. Time to do one more cut. And now we've got 4 pieces that are 16 millimeters in thickness, about 20 millimeters in width, all of which have one good reference edge, and all have one rough edge from the table saw. The next step is we're going to visit the small thickness planer and get this down to square stock, which is going to be 16 millimeters by 16 millimeters.